Hello there my RPG lovers and welcome to another video. Ghost of Tsushima is a game that doesn't need a lot of introduction.
This the samurai?
It was an action-adventure that came out exclusively on PS4 in 2020 and later on PS5 with some notable next-gen updates. I got my PS5 almost a year ago and one of the first games I bought for that console was Ghost of Tsushima. To be honest, I'm not crazy about samurais or feudal Japan settings in games, so I wasn't in a rush to start playing it. The main reason I bought it is because there are so many people that heavily praise the game. From big media critics and credible YouTubers to regular gamers on the internet. So I've come to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore, especially as someone who considers himself to be a game reviewer, amongst other things. And we got The reason why I'm even mentioning this is because I want you to know that I wasn't biased at all before I played the game. I actually thought I'm not going to like it that much. And never in my wildest gamer dreams had I thought that I'm going to call this game a masterpiece, or any game that I review, as a matter of fact. That doesn't mean the game is perfect, it definitely has some problems that I'm going to discuss. Quite possibly a lot more that you would expect to hear for a game that they claim to be a masterpiece. However, my personal criteria for analyzing games is quite simple. I judge the game by what it's trying to do and how well it does it. There's a lot of nuances in between, of course, but that's the general idea. Ghost of Tsushima is trying to tell a compelling story about a certain samurai who survived the huge Mongol invasion on his islands. This game also tries to be extremely immersive, all for the ultimate goal of telling a compelling story, with huge amounts of respect for the source material.
We will win this war. As samurai.
The immersive nature of this game and the high attention to detail is not only related to the story and the setting. The gameplay itself has received a phenomenal attention to detail. The core of the gameplay in Ghost of Tsushima is amazing, even though it's not exactly 100% unique. Don't get me wrong, it definitely has unique features, but it also tries to adapt some well-known gameplay elements of similar open-world action-adventure games. And it does it exceptionally well, for the most part.
A Japanese quiver.
A gift to my greatest student. I fear the worst.
I think this is extremely rare in gaming nowadays. It's one thing to have a great story in your game, but having an equally great gameplay, which blends so well with the story and the setting, is nothing short of amazing. Open-world action adventures and RPGs can usually struggle with some of their key features, whether that's the story, the open world, or the gameplay in general. Ghost of Tsushima is not a flawless game, it has some notable issues as well. But after 24 plus years of gaming, it's pretty much the only time I won't cringe when someone uses the word masterpiece to describe the general quality of the game. Anyway, let's go back to the beginning and start talking about the actual game.
We are the warriors of Tsushima.
There is no shortage of amazing cutscenes in Ghost of Tsushima, and the intro cutscene is no different. You're immediately greeted with top-of-the-line presentation in terms of the visuals, camera work, and voice acting. The island of Tsushima is being invaded by the great Mongol army led by the ruthless Khotun Khan. The game does a decent job with portraying this character as the main antagonist, it's pretty easy to hate him. And as with almost all major characters in the game, his voice actor did an outstanding job with bringing this character to life.
You are a warrior. I can see that. You trained your whole life for this.
However, I think the game fell flat when it comes to Khotun Khan from the story and especially from the gameplay perspective. But more about that a little bit later. You play as Jin Sakai, and together with your uncle Lord Shimura, you desperately march into the final battle against the Mongol invaders. Now of course, the beginning sequence is just a tutorial, but it's also an important story segment, because it sets up the whole game. I usually dislike needlessly stretched out tutorial segments, which many AAA games seem to love nowadays. Mainly because they can feel too long and out of place, even when they make sense from the story perspective. But that's not the case at all in this game. On the contrary, it's one of the best tutorial sections I ever experienced in these types of games. It gives you just enough context behind the most important parts of the story, and learning the basic gameplay mechanics as you go feel quite natural. Jin has these flashbacks from his youth, which are used to teach the player the basic gameplay mechanics. These flashbacks persist through the entire game in different story segments, so it's not something they just used for the sake of the tutorial. Even the Iki Island Expansion has more than a few flashbacks, and their goal is always to tell you something important from Jin's past. They are really important for Jin's character development in general. But the most important segment for the story introduction is showing the true meaning of the samurai codes. The beginning battle was a slaughterhouse for the samurais, but Jin somehow survived with the help of Yuna. Yuna is a major character in the story, but she's also a thief, and her methods of dealing with the Mongols goes against everything that Jin believes in as a samurai. It doesn't take long for Jin to adapt to these new methods and break the samurai codes, but further down the line, this has a major impact on the main story.
I am proud of the warrior, the man you have become.
Anyway, Yuna leads you through the village so you can recover your sword and armor. You get to do some fights so you can get the feel of the basic combat mechanics, and right after this, Jin makes a very stupid decision. He goes straight to the castle full of Mongols to try and kill Khotun Khan. Yuna doesn't think this is a good idea, I don't think this is a good idea, my dog doesn't think it's a good idea, but he does it anyway. But for a samurai, it's pretty much the only solution because it's the most honorable thing to do. A full frontal attack once again against the whole castle with no help at all. Even though this is pretty stupid if you think about it logically, it serves to show the player the true weight of the samurai code. That comes into perspective when Jin decides to break it out of necessity because it's the only way to stop the Mongol invasion.
But going against my instincts, my code.
It's better than getting wiped out by the Mongols. We have to fight back.
But before that, you get into an unwinnable fight against Khotun Khan, where the game goes full Hollywood mode. He doesn't kill you for some reason, he just decides to shove you off the bridge. And if you died here, that would be a very short game. Yeah, it's pretty stupid, but it's not a big deal. However, there is another similar segment in the main story where Khotun Khan spares your life again for seemingly unknown reason, and I found that pretty stupid as well. Anyway, the game opens up almost completely after you fall from the bridge. Ghost of Tsushima has 3 acts in total, and each of them has a separate map, which you can only unlock by pushing the main story forwards. From this point on, your main goal is to recruit enough people who can help you with driving the Mongols off the island and ultimately kill the Khotun Khan. Your first major goal is to save your uncle from Komoda Castle because it turns out that he survives. Khotun Khan is trying to convince him to join his army and help him with conquering the Japan mainland.
Lord Sakai will fight until his last breath. As will I.
But the game offers you some quality optional content as well. Besides the main quest, which the game refers to as Tales, you get Tales of Tsushima and Mythic Tales. All of this available content is of very high quality, and they found a great way to incentivize the players to complete them from the gameplay aspect as well. Come to think of it, the game doesn't have a ton of unique characters that you're going to meet. It has around 5 or 6 very important characters for the story, but all of them are very memorable and well written. This has to be one of the best examples of quality over quantity when it comes to quests in an open world game. But this game still manages to have a lot of content without feeling bloated with meaningless activities, which is the bane of most open world games. That doesn't mean the game doesn't have some simple optional activities, which reward you with some cosmetics or useful items for the combat. But even those activities don't feel mindless. Instead of bombarding you with dozens of different characters throughout the game, Ghost of Tsushima tries to create a deep character development for a handful of NPCs you meet. These characters have up to 9 different acts that you can do. However, you can't just rush to complete all the acts for a character because, like I said before, the game opens up more as you progress through the main story. I'm not saying that this is a superior way of doing characters and quests in an open world game. Come to think of it, it's less believable compared to games which introduce you to many different characters throughout the game. But once again, this game focuses a lot more on the quality of the content, because each quest you do for these characters will probably stick with you for a very long time. Sensei Ishikawa has to be one of my most favorite, if not the most favorite character in the game. He's such a well-written character with an amazing voice actor.
It's a beautiful weapon.
Of course it is. And there's nothing more painful to me than a perfect bow ineptly used.
And yeah, you can say the exact same thing for most characters in the game, but Ishikawa is something special if you ask me. His personal tale is equally interesting, even though the pacing of this tale is a little bit off. This tale has 9 acts that will take you to the different zones on the whole map. Ishikawa is a master archer and he believes that his previous student double-crossed him and started working with the Mongols. Tomoe was the most skilled student of Ishikawa and the way he speaks about her is just mesmerizing, for the lack of a better word. It's super immersive and it's easily one of the best examples of storytelling in games.
Knowing and doing are different.
You are questioning whether I am samurai? Tomoe was my greatest achievement. But if I must, I will destroy her to save this island.
This tale gradually builds up the legend of Tomoe with every quest you do with Ishikawa. According to him, she's a natural killer and he's not too surprised that she decided to betray him. That being said, the tale itself started losing some steam after a while and it felt to me like it was supposed to be a lot shorter. You're basically playing a long game of cat and mouse and it gets a bit exhausting after a while. Interestingly enough, we can say the exact same thing about another tale. Lady Masako is another really important character for the story and her tale is 9 chapters long as well. Her whole family was killed and you can help her figure out who did it and get a proper revenge. Even though I think Ishikawa is a better character in general, Lady Masako's tale was a little bit more interesting because it had a stronger plot twist. But it suffered from the same problem, and again, I think it should have been a lot shorter if you ask me. Just like with Ishikawa's tale, you're playing a very long cat and mouse game, even though the set piece of each individual chapter of the tale was interesting enough. If we take in consideration how fun the gameplay is and how well these characters are put together, this critique doesn't hold that much weight, but I think it's worth mentioning. Yuna's tale had a perfect length, her personal story was interesting and the gameplay was pretty good throughout the whole tale. I think all tales should be around 5 or 6 acts in total. Then we have what's possibly the most interesting story content in the game, which will be the mythic tales. This is where the game steps into a fantasy setting or mythic setting if you will. You won't get to do a ton of mythic tales, but all of them are worth doing. They are presented in a different cinematic way and they usually have a legendary hero attached to them which turns into a great boss fight. Besides the interesting story that's presented with a great in-game cutscene, mythic tales have super strong rewards, which can unlock the full potential of this combat system. The spirit of Yarikawa's vengeance has to be my most favorite mythic tale in the game. You're basically chasing a legendary ghost warrior who has a very unique combat move. You can unlock some very powerful skills from doing mythic tales, and I absolutely love how this blends so well with the progression system. Before you get some of the strong abilities, the combat felt grounded and a lot more realistic. Even though it might feel like these abilities break the general idea of the combat, they're absolutely great from the gameplay and the story perspective. The more you push the story forward, the legend of Jin Sakai grows. People start calling him a ghost because of the way he fights.
I am the ghost.
So it's only appropriate for you to have some over-the-top abilities, like the Ghost Dance and Dance of Wrath. I have no complaints about mythic tales, they are super well done, especially for what's considered to be an optional content. To go back to our original discussion about the main story, it never gets too complicated or hard to understand. It was kinda predictable if you ask me, but not in a bad way, because it's presented and played out perfectly. It turns into an emotional roller coaster for Jin and you really get attached to his character and his struggles. Well, at least I did. I'm trying really hard to avoid any spoilers because you need to experience this game by yourself. To conclude my spoiler-free thoughts about the main story, it's one of the best I ever experienced.
If I run, I won't be able to unite our people against the Khan.
It doesn't have any crazy plot twists, but it doesn't need them. It's a pretty simple story with an outstanding presentation and believable characters. There is one thing that bothers me though. All the dialogue and cutscenes are unskippable. Now listen, even when you have an amazing story like in Ghost of Tsushima, I strongly believe that your game should have the option to skip the dialogue and cutscenes. I'm not sure about the New Game Plus mode because I still didn't want to start it, but I will be very disappointed if you can't skip the dialogue and cutscenes in that mode. Now let's talk about the spoilers. I'll give you the chance to skip this part and I highly recommend skipping it if you didn't play the game. Otherwise, you're going to ruin an amazing storytelling experience, but if you already played the game, I'm waiting for you at the other side. You still there? Good. The first major plot twist is about your old buddy Rizzo.
The Khan put a bounty on the ghost.
He started working with the Mongols because his people were starving, and he also had an old grudge against Jin. I guess this is the first major boss fight in the main story, but he survives, and you get to fight him again near the end of the game. There was some foreshadowing of Rizzo's betrayal, but I thought it was a bit too obvious to be true.
You're crazy.
It turns out I was wrong. You might think I'm over-exaggerating a bit, but trust me, the facial expressions of these characters is top-notch. They managed to capture and act in such a way that you can try to guess how the characters feel in dialogue.
You're not as handsome as me, but it's not bad.
Good facial animations and great voice acting are not enough, the dialogue has to be well written for this to work. Ghost of Tsushima just nailed all of those aspects. The second major plot twist is not actually a good plot twist because I thought it was pretty obvious. Your uncle was not happy that you broke the samurai code, and that was obviously bothering him a lot. Khotun Khan was frequently telling him about your actions, and he just refused to believe that.
It is one of the many differences between us.
Then why have my men found their brothers stabbed in the back?
Lord Sakai would never resort to such tactics.
But when he realized that's actually the truth, you could tell that was bothering him in the majority of dialogue with Jin. He wanted to adopt Jin so he could be his son, but after you retake Castle Shimura, Jin just refused.
I am not your son. I am the ghost.
That's because his uncle wanted to use Yuna as a scapegoat to justify Jin's actions and restore his samurai honor. But of course Jin refused, which ironically is a very honorable deed because he didn't want to hurt Yuna. Before this happened, Jin and Yuna decided to use poison to give them an advantage in fights. Naturally, Lord Shimura was totally against such dishonorable methods, but Jin and Yuna did it anyway. Jin then gets imprisoned for disobeying his uncle, but of course he manages to escape with the help of Kenji. What has to be the biggest plot twist here is the death of your horse. It was actually a pretty emotional moment for Jin, especially because you get to name the horse in the beginning of the game. Jin will call the horse by that name up to this very point, but he'll get a new horse a bit later, and you get to name him again. Anyway, chapter 3 is pretty weak story-wise, your only goal is to find and finally kill Khotun Khan. Jin still needs the help of his uncle for the final push on Khotun Khan, so he writes him a letter. It all leads down to the final fight, but this is only the beginning of the end. I was pretty disappointed with the final fight with Khotun Khan because I think the game has a lot better boss fights in general. And this is a rare fight in the game where the hitboxes were not very good. The game has a couple of phases of these fights. At the end, it turns into a much bigger fight with multiple enemies, where Khotun Khan just becomes another elite Mongol soldier. It doesn't even feel like a real boss fight in this phase, which is disappointing.
And another will come.
Not to mention that Khotun Khan's character was very one-dimensional. He's just a generic antagonist with zero character development who made some pretty stupid decisions. But now, the real ending begins. Your uncle requested to meet him at their usual sparring spot down the lake. And again, his uncle is a very honorable samurai, so his actions are always kinda predictable. That was actually his huge weakness in this war, but he failed to realize this. That's why the ending of the main story is also predictable. It was obvious that he wanted to fight Jin at the end. The fight was okay, nothing special compared to some great boss fights you can find. However, there is a very touching moment in the gameplay that can only happen in these fights. When Jin gets killed in pretty much all other boss fights in the game, the enemy will always finish him off with a killing blow. But if you fail against Lord Shimura, he will never do that. I really love that little attention to detail.
Goodbye, son.
Their relationship was very believable and memorable. That's why I love the story despite some of its shortcomings. You get to spare your uncle or kill him at the end, which is pretty much the only decision you get to make in the game. Some dialogues give you the opportunity to select an option, but it never feels like that truly matters. Even this decision won't affect the game that much, but it seems more like an attention to detail than anything else. The story of the game and all the tales are linear, which means that you won't have a ton of reasons to replay the game, at least not from the story perspective. But the gameplay tells a totally different story. The action gameplay in Ghost of Tsushima has outstanding animations, the attacks feel very impactful, and it has a good character progression system. I wasn't so sure about the progression until I invested a lot of hours in the game, but let's first talk about the combat itself. The core of this combat system is different stances which Jin uses, which you gradually unlock by doing certain gameplay activities. It's absolutely necessary to select appropriate stance depending on what enemy you're currently fighting. Well, that's the case with the hard and lethal difficulties. I can't say for sure about lower difficulty levels. I actually started the game on lethal, but after a couple of hours I changed my mind. But after I completed the game on hard, I will definitely try to 100% this game on lethal and lethal plus difficulty. The thing about the hardest difficulty is that almost everyone can one-shot you in the beginning, which is pretty annoying when you're just trying to learn the mechanics. But anyway, hard difficulty still managed to offer some pretty decent challenge even after you get the grasp of the mechanics. Speaking of which, the base mechanics are quite simple yet very well done. Each stance has just a couple of melee hits, but they all have different animations, which are effective against different enemy types. It seems pretty simple until you get into a fight versus multiple opponents. You have to change stances on the fly if you want to kill enemies in the most effective way possible. I can't name a single thing which feels more enjoyable in this game than being able to flawlessly cut down a whole bunch of Mongols with only your trusted samurai sword. Jin's main resource in fights is resolve, which starts filling up when you kill enemies and parry attacks. This might seem like a stamina system, which you can find in most Souls-like games nowadays, but it's not. Resolve doesn't limit your character movement, or the amount of hits you can do, or anything like that. On the other side, you can use Resolve for a whole bunch of things. This is the one and only resource for healing, but you can also use it for a bunch of different skills and special abilities. Stronger abilities that you'll get to unlock require a higher amount of Resolve. You can improve your resolve by doing certain activities called Bamboo Strike, where you need to play a little minigame. Bamboo Strikes require you to memorize the button combination and then try to execute it perfectly. It's a fun little minigame with reasonable amount of challenge. I'm usually not a huge fan of minigames in general, but Ghost of Tsushima developers put a lot of thought behind every single feature in the game, and Bamboo Strike is not an exception. That wouldn't matter a lot if the basic mechanics of the combat are not so good. Each strike you can do with your sword feels great because of the amazing animations and very responsive controls. Not to mention the great sound design as well. I will never get tired of hearing the enemy choke on their own blood. Finishing moves in general can be described in a similar manner, especially those performed from the stealth. But even the regular attacks have a decent amount of weight, even though the combat is pretty fast. This is something that a lot of similar action adventures can struggle with, to say the least. The streamlined nature of this combat system actually works in its favor. Jin has a lot of gadgets at his disposal, but the whole fighting system is built around one weapon type, the katana. Sure, you get a couple of very useful ranged weapons, but your sword is the primary weapon. So focusing only on a single melee weapon allowed Sucker Punch Studios to create a great sword fighting mechanics and polish it up as much as possible. If we would try to compare it with another game with similar set of rules, The closest game would be The Witcher 3. Geralt was also limited to swords as well because of the lore, just like Jin. The lack of weapon types can sometimes be one of the main reasons for the repetitive nature of the gameplay. However, I don't think that Ghost of Tsushima has that issue. The game constantly tries to keep the combat fresh, with including new gadgets, abilities, and slightly different enemy types, which require changing your playstyle a bit. There is a very noticeable difficulty spike when you unlock a new chapter and zones that you can explore. I would say that the pacing of the gameplay is pretty good as well. As soon as I got very comfortable with the controls and the moveset, the enemies from the second chapter started doing more damage and they seem more aggressive in fights. Same goes for the enemies from the third chapter. However, the game offers you a lot of gadgets and unique abilities that you can use, which can make every fight a lot easier but interesting. Jin's secondary weapon is a short bow that you can get very early in the game by doing Ishikawa's tail. The range gameplay feels very satisfying, especially when you start killing people with headshots. You'll get a couple of different arrow types, and you can also unlock a long bow by doing a corresponding mythic tail. The range on this bow is amazing, and it also allows you to do headshots against enemies with metal helmets. Short bow is faster, but the arrows will just bounce off the helmet of stronger enemies. The game is actually filled with small but noticeable character progression elements like this. Most of the upgrades that you can get for weapons and abilities might seem very minor, but they can change the gameplay and your playstyle quite a bit. When it comes to ranged enemies, this game uses a simple yet very effective way of letting you know when to dodge the projectiles. You can hear them loud and clear, and this is supposed to let their friends know when to duck. You can easily use this to your advantage in many situations, not just by knowing when to dodge, but for counter-attacks as well. It's a little bit silly if you think about it, but gameplay-wise, it's actually great. I love it. You really have to focus on what your enemy is doing in combat so you can dodge or parry, so having to rely purely on the sound cue for dodging arrows is a great idea. Speaking about specific mechanics, you'll get to do a lot of standoffs. It's basically like revolver duels, but in a samurai style, it's all about timing. Standoff is definitely a gimmicky mechanic, but it fits with the theme of the game quite nicely. Even this technique can be improved, and you can cut down up to 4 people at once. I believe I only failed the standoff a couple of times in the whole game, it's pretty easy to pull off. The enemy will try to throw you off balance by moving their body, but it's not that hard to release the button as soon as they move. Even though it's a very gimmicky mechanic, it feels great and it's fun to do, it never gets boring. It's a perfect way to start a big fight if you don't want to bother with stealth. Speaking of stealth, there is a separate line of progression that focuses on ghost weapons, and you can improve the usage of those weapons in a couple of different ways. This game has a surprisingly good stealth system in general, and the weapons I just mentioned can help you a lot with that playstyle. One feature I wasn't a huge fan of is the focused hearing mechanic, which allows you to see all enemies around you. It's not just about Ghost of Tsushima when it comes to this. I don't like similar mechanics in other action adventures, because it straight up feels like cheating. This mechanic makes the stealth gameplay a lot easier, and I only use it when I tried really hard to remain hidden. Look, if the game is going to give me an option to use such OP mechanic, I will use it, regardless of what I think about it. But I would prefer if it's not in the game, and I tried really hard not to use it. What I really like about stealth assassinations is the nice little progression system around it. When you first start killing people from stealth, the animation is very long, and there is a higher chance for enemies to detect you. Once you start upgrading your weapons, you will speed up the animation and reduce the chance for enemies to detect you. You can also find stealth bonuses on some armor pieces as well. Chain assassinations are very fun to pull off, especially if you do them by jumping from rooftops. All of these stealth features heavily resemble Ubisoft games from the past 10 years or so. If you played any recent Assassin's Creed game or Far Cry, the stealth gameplay in Ghost of Tsushima will be very familiar. However, it feels more grounded and, dare I say, realistic, especially in the early game. Well, except the focused hearing, I guess. To put it simply, killing enemies from stealth is very satisfying and it has a nice, simple progression line. You can be more creative in stealth, especially when you unlock more weapons like the blowgun. Although, to be honest, I think this weapon was almost completely redundant. I mean, it's fun to make the enemies rage and start fighting their allies, but it's only fun a couple of times. I also don't see the point with the poison darts that much, because I would rather use my bow or the hidden blades. That might be just my personal preference, but that's how I felt about this weapon. You unlock the blowgun very late in the game, and that's probably one of the reasons why it doesn't feel very satisfying to use. Other options just feel more superior. I'm not saying it's useless, but I didn't use it a lot. Then we have the boss fights, which feel quite different compared to regular fights, but the game still uses the same rule set. You're just limited to your sword and abilities, you can't use any gadgets in boss fights.
You lived your life in a castle. He made you soft.
You pretty much have to focus on avoiding, parrying and striking the opponents. I think the game does a great job with boss moveset, and like I said before, the best boss fights can be found in the optional content, the Mythic Tales. It's not uncommon to die a bunch of times during boss fights, even when you manage to get a firm grasp of the combat mechanics. The boss fights are hands down one of my most favorite content in the game. The camera perspective is different in boss fights, and the game does this automatically. Actually, it likes to do this a lot in different situations, because it's a dynamic camera system. It will even go to first person in a specific situation. For the most part it works great, but sometimes I really wish to zoom out the camera, especially when you're investigating. You'll do this a lot in the game, and zoomed in camera is supposed to help you to focus on a specific clue. Maybe this is just me, but I'm getting more disoriented with such camera angles. I'm also wondering what happened to this zoomed out perspective when you climb on the roofs, because I'm pretty sure the game just used it in the tutorial sequence, and when you managed to climb on some mountains after you did some platforming. I think it would be great if you had this option while climbing on roofs in general. The game also has a smart camera follow feature, for the lack of a better word. When you're traveling with a companion by foot or with a horse, you can hold the left thumbstick up and Jin will automatically follow the movement of the companion. It's a subtle but very useful quality of life feature. The last thing I would like to mention before we start talking about the progression is the climbing mechanic. Nowadays, most open world games have at least some sort of a climbing mechanic. Ghost of Tsushima has a very simple but functional climbing system, which makes the vertical exploration in this open world a lot easier. The placement of these rocks feels a bit artificial and convenient, but who cares, it gets the job done. A bit later in the game you unlock a special hook, which improves the climbing system a bit. It allows you to reach previously unreachable areas. Using the hook is probably the only mechanic in the game that feels a bit clunky and not very precise. It's not bad, but it could be a lot smoother. The Iki Island Expansion introduced another usage for the hook, which I don't like at all actually. The base game uses the hook not only for reaching higher places where you climb, but in enemy camps as well. It feels like an actual mechanic that you can take the advantage of. But pulling stuff with the hook just slows down your progression for no apparent reason. I don't know why they thought this would be a good idea. It serves no purpose except slowing you down. The progression system in Ghost of Tsushima has a decent amount of depth, especially for an action-adventure game. At first, I wasn't really sure about this, and I thought I'm not going to like it that much, but I was wrong. This game has a very streamlined looting system. It's not a game where you're going to loot things behind every corner. Supplies is the main item you will find all over the map, and a couple of more items. Speaking of gear, I didn't expect to see an amazing customization, but once again, I was wrong. It's not amazing by any means, but it's pretty good for a story-driven action-adventure. You only have a couple of gear slots and you can combine different armor pieces. The chest piece is the most important, and it's the only armor piece with some actual gameplay benefits. All armor sets you find in the game can be upgraded, which will improve the stats and change the appearance of the item. The whole armor set will change visually, but the game has a nice little option which allows you to use the previous appearance of the item. I always had just enough materials to upgrade my armor or weapons, even though I try to pick up these items wherever I go. So I would say it's balanced pretty well. The term streamlining is usually used in a negative connotation when we talk about games, but this is a very good example of streamlining, if you ask me. There is no need for a bunch of different items to loot which don't serve any purpose. On the other side, some people won't like the idea of carrying the same weapon throughout the whole game. I always enjoy when games give you the option to find different weapons. Even though Ghost of Tsushima doesn't have this option, you get different skins for your armor and weapons. Upgrading the damage of your weapon is a must, so like I said, you need to keep your eye on those flashy items. One of the side activities that you can do in the open world is collecting different skins for your weapons and armor. These activities usually involve some platforming, which is a nice way to break the monotony of the regular gameplay. There is also miscellaneous stuff to collect, but I'm not exactly crazy about collecting stuff for the sake of collecting. The stats on armor pieces are definitely effective, but I found them a bit boring. The expansion started going crazy with some of the stats for new armor sets, which can give you some flashy new abilities. And speaking about flashy abilities, it's not like the game lacks them in general. I mentioned mythic techniques before, which you can get after you complete mythic tales. A couple of them feel a bit OP, but they go well with the whole idea of the quote-unquote ghost. The game is not afraid to go a bit crazy with these abilities, even though the core idea of the combat is very grounded in reality. When the legend about the Jin's deeds starts spreading out, you'll have actual abilities to back up those claims. After a lot of hours I invested in the game, I stopped expecting to see new combat mechanics, but the game always had something in its sleeve. The ghost stance that you unlock quite late in the game is the perfect example of this. It gives you the chance to kill a couple of enemies at once if you previously killed multiple enemies without getting hit, or if you executed the leader. Far too many games can create a noticeable disparity between the story and the gameplay, especially where the main character is depicted as some sort of a hero. Ghost of Tsushima doesn't have that problem, even though you could argue that some of these crazy strong abilities are OP. The game doesn't lack the challenge for those who seek it, so I don't think this is an issue. Ultimately, the most important thing is having fun with the gameplay, which is of course highly subjective. I'm still having a lot of fun with killing enemies, even after I completed the main story. Now let's talk about exploration a little bit. This game has a very unique mechanic for the exploration, which gets rid of the need for a minimap or even a compass. I don't remember the last time when some big open world game tried to change the fundamentals of the exploration. We usually get to see a full-blown minimap, which are essentially a GPS system with a ton of information, or the magical compass, which will show us much more than just cardinal directions. I'm not trying to put Skyrim and The Witcher 3 on blast here, because many other games are doing the exact same thing. And I love those games for what they are, but I always felt like many players can easily miss the beauty of an open world game. Your eyes can get stuck on minimaps or compass a lot more than they should, instead of absorbing the environment of the open world. Ghost of Tsushima uses a wind mechanic to guide you through your next objective, which totally removes the need for any other navigational feature. You just swipe the touchpad and the wind starts blowing in the direction of your objective. Sure, it's a bit silly and gimmicky, and this basically means that the weather is always windy. You're artificially creating wind whenever you swipe the touchpad, even when the weather is not suitable for such windy conditions. But tell you what, I don't care. If this is what it takes to actually focus on the amazing looking open world, instead of staring at the minimap, I'll deal with artificial winds. And to add to that discussion, the exploration itself is pretty good. This open world is not exactly very dynamic, there are only a handful of random events which can happen. It's either a random Mongol patrol, a villager that you can save from the Mongols, animal attack, and that's pretty much it. I could see how someone would make an argument about open world being a little bit empty. But then again, you wouldn't expect to find a bunch of NPCs behind every corner who can give you some stupid side quests during the massive Mongol invasion. You're in the middle of a war, and the game will happily remind you about it while you're exploring. Not just when it comes to occupied villages full of Mongols, you'll find traces of war even on the most remote areas on the islands. It's one thing to tell you about this in dialogue and cutscenes, but you really have to back it up with the environmental storytelling, and Ghost of Tsushima does an amazing job on this field as well. The open world itself is not extremely big, it's nowhere near the size of some other action adventures like recent Assassin's Creed games, for example. To put it simply, if you like open world games in general, I think you will love this game. Anyway, to sum up the exploration, I think it's pretty damn good. The map has a lot of verticality, there is a lot of platforming and side activities which will reward you properly. Once again, quality over quantity, and most of these activities are optional. You can choose to focus only on tails if you wish to. If your eyes are still serving you well, I don't think I'll have to convince you how beautiful this game looks, even though I won't be able to show you 4K footage. Ghost of Tsushima is probably the only game in recent years that makes me want to take screenshots after every 2 minutes. I'm really not easily impressed with the graphics in games, and I don't spend a lot of time talking about how games look in my reviews. And if I do, it's usually not for a good reason. At first, the island of Tsushima seemed to me like it's going to have a very one-dimensional look with not a lot of visual variety. That was certainly not the case because the zones in each chapter look noticeably different. There is a lot of attention to detail when it comes to visuals, especially for weather effects. The visual effects for leaves have to be one of the most memorable things about the game ever since we saw the first trailer for the game. That continues throughout the whole game, and you'll see a lot of different scenes with some great leaf physics and very good lighting. We could possibly say the same thing about the grass. It's a very dominant visual effect on the whole map. Ghost of Tsushima has a very good weather system with a bunch of different weather conditions. These weather conditions can change the mood of the game quite drastically, and I don't believe I have to talk a lot, just take a look at some of these examples. It makes you want to stop whatever you're doing and just absorb the atmosphere which the game creates. Then we have the character models and facial animations. The facial animations are very well done and all major characters have a distinctive and memorable look. The character models look very good, but they are not exactly of the highest quality for this day and age. What did bother me when it comes to visuals is the lack of torches. As far as I'm aware, the only light source you can use when it's dark is fire arrows, and it's not a great way to get around. The game doesn't have a lot of dungeons or anything like that, but whenever I found myself in a very dark corner, I really wanted to use a torch. That's probably the biggest critique that I can think of when it comes to the visuals. Ghost of Tsushima has a realistic art style which usually don't age all that well compared to the more stylized graphics. I don't think this will be the case with Ghost of Tsushima, especially because of the weather effects and the great lighting, but only time will tell. One thing is for certain, the visuals of this game and the atmosphere it creates will stick with me for a very, very long time.
More blue flowers.
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, but the sound design is very good as well. I know, shocking.
Of course it is.
This is not exactly making my job easier because there just aren't a lot of things to complain about. I believe I already talked about voice acting quite a bit, but I didn't mention that you have the option to play the game with Japanese voiceover as well, with English subtitles. And there's even an option to play the game in black and white mode, which is supposedly inspired by Akira Kurosawa movies. The general quality of sound design is great, there is really not that much to add about that discussion. But when it comes to attention to detail, there are a few things worth mentioning. The speaker on your PS5 controller will play specific sounds in certain situations, which makes the game even more immersive. The sound effect for the wind is what you're going to hear a lot, but there are also some combat sounds in boss fights. The haptic feedback is also very good for this game. Drawing your bow feels great, and even the gallop of a horse has a very subtle but satisfying haptic feedback. All of that combined with the amazing soundtrack makes the game truly epic. The Iki Island Expansion adds, well, another island in the game. While the main story of this island is quite different compared to the base game, it still has a lot of similarities. The Mongols invaded this island as well, and they will be your main enemy. This expansion feels like one big mythic tale, mainly because the story of Iki Island steps into a fantasy setting. The character called Eagle is the main antagonist of the story. She is a shaman, and she is messing with everyone's mind on this island. Jin is also affected by this, but his mind is a lot stronger.
Edge? People will die because of you. Focus.
You'll occasionally have these visions while exploring the island, which will trigger by interacting with certain objects. Your main goal is to stop the madness and of course kill the main antagonist. The island introduces some brand new characters, and I have to say that most of them are not very interesting, especially compared to the characters from the base game. They are very forgettable. But the story itself is well done. It's quite different compared to the main story of the base game, and I think that's exactly what expansions and DLCs should strive for. Besides the main story, the island has other activities. You'll find new mythic tales which will reward you with some very unique combat moves. You'll get to fight a brand new enemy type called the Shamans. They only serve to buff their allies, it's not a big deal. As soon as you arrive on the island, you unlock a new technique that's related to your horse, and it's very useful. The boss fights you'll have on this island are great as well. I mentioned before that this expansion expands the usage of the hook, and like I said, I don't like it that much. It really feels unnecessary because it slows down your progress for no apparent reason. Overall, it's a pretty good expansion with a decent amount of extra contents. Masterpiece is not a word I get to use a lot when I talk about games. In fact, this is probably the first time ever since I started doing reviews. This game is not without its problems, and I did my best to talk about them in this video. However, the game design in Ghost of Tsushima is of the highest quality in modern gaming. All major and minor features have received an amazing level of detail and polish, which is not something you can say for a lot of AAA games nowadays. It's very important to give credit to studios like Sucker Punch because there are dying breeds. Anyway, tell me, do you agree with me in the comments below?
Stop wasting my time.
Do you think that Ghost of Tsushima is a masterpiece, and if not, tell me why. If you like this review, I've got more of them on the channel that you can check out. Be sure to like, subscribe and share this video if you want to show your support. And if you feel like going a step further, you can always become a Patreon or a YouTube member. Even the smallest support means a lot. Big thanks to all of my current supporters. That will be all, and I'll see you in the next one.